Hi, welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm joined today by Elaine Maynard-Adams, who I think is at this point our longest serving Board of Ed member, although it was in a couple different installments. And we're going to talk about the schools, not just the budget, but what the system looks like. So welcome, Elaine.
Thank you, Rana. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk education.
Well, great. I guess first I want you to say a few words about all your history with the Board of Ed and what the experience has been like.
So I was the parent of a third grader at Harbor School, president of the PTO, when I was approached by two longstanding old-time Democrats who dropped by my house one night and in the spring and said, "You should run for the Board of Ed." I should what? Anyway, we talked about it. That was 1991. And I ran, and I served until 1999. I made the decision not to run again after 1999. My daughter was in high school, closing in on her final years. I wanted to be doing the college search and all those other things. So I stepped down in 99. I was recruited to come back in 2005, I think it was. And I don't recall whether I served for one term or two terms, but we had an incident with a very popular football coach who was terminated by the superintendent. I was on the grievance committee at that time who heard the grievance, and we backed the superintendent. And my local party in that election said, "Hey, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want you on our ticket."
I kind of remember that was a big controversy at the time.
It sure was. So I walked away. In 2019, I was approached again to run for the Board of Ed. I said, "Okay, fine," and that brings us to today. So I think it's a total of 18 years, probably 17 and a half of which have been pretty controversial. But
this in London, that's actually kind of the norm.
It is the norm. You're absolutely right.
So what's the thing that's been in the papers and in the news recently is the budget, the flat funding by City Council, the crossing guard controversy, and just a lot of funny alliances and disagreements among people who aren't necessarily always aligned or usually agree. So I think to start, we should just talk about the budget. You had an opinion piece in recently, and I know it was in response to some of the arguments that the mayor and the finance director of the city and city council have made assumptions about or made statements about. So what do you have to say about our budget process?
So two things. There's the budget, and then there's the budget process. So I just want to say a word or two about the budget itself. As the country was recovering from COVID, I think everybody knows that we had received huge amounts of money from the federal government to address learning loss. Well, you can't address learning loss unless you hire more teachers and you hire classroom assistants and you hire reading specialists, for example. We did all of those things knowing that eventually the COVID money was going to run out. And for the last 5 years, we have been, every time we talk to the council, every time we go downtown at budget time, we had warned them that we are going to hit this fiscal cliff. Last year was the year we hit the fiscal cliff. All of the federal COVID relief dollars ran out. And while the money ran out, the needs did not. So we still have kids with enormous needs, social and emotional health issues, learning issues, and we had lost a huge amount of money that had been helping these kids for the last 5 years. So that set us up for a clash last year. I think most people who read papers or get news from somewhere other than social media probably understand that there's, there was arguments to be had on both sides. So the end result was that we needed to trim about $7.5 million from our budget. Our priority, the board met and the board agreed that the number one priority was to keep teachers in classrooms. And everything else was on the table. We eliminated 56 positions. I think 6 were administrators. And those positions ran from the top of the line administrators to part-time crossing guards. We eliminated the crossing guards in large part because we'd been saying for a number of years that this is a public safety issue. It does not belong in the budget of the Board of Ed. Years ago, it was in the police department budget. Nobody remembers how it got dumped on us, but it did. It's a public safety issue. It's as simple as that. We eliminated all after-school programs that are not funded by grants. We eliminated summer school programs, except those that are mandated by law. So certain students with certain special needs, we are required by law to provide summer programming for them, and of course we did that. But everything else, all the optional stuff, went away. It was painful, it was ugly, and every board meeting we seem to be reminded of something we had last year that we don't have this year.
And when you talk about classroom teachers, I know that when the new schools were built, our class sizes in New London are relatively high in the elementary school level. I think it's 26 students,
We've worked pretty hard to bring those numbers down.
Oh, that's good.
And where there are, in the case of children with special needs that are in mainstream classrooms, for example, many of them have paraeducators with them. So we've tried over the years to sort of reduce the student-teacher ratio, or student-teacher ratio, to try and bring them more in line and give the teacher a better opportunity to work with such a wide range of needs.
And while we're talking about special education, that's mostly federal mandates, correct?
Sure. Yep.
So I am of the belief that as a federal mandate, the federal government didn't go broke, giving us all these COVID funds. They could fund special ed, the requirements by federal law.
They certainly could. This is actually it's a great example of an underfunded mandate. You must do this, but we're only going to give you 50% of the cost, or 60% or 20%. And that's a problem, not just in education, but that's a problem everywhere.
It is. I call it trickle-down austerity because at the federal level, it could be easily absorbed and it could be decided upon to fund it, but the burden passes down, 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 and districts like New London that have a lot of kids who are vulnerable for one reason or another end up bearing a lot of the burden, too much of it.
We do. But the demographics, the socioeconomics of our city make it the place where people who are in need of affordable housing go, where people who need access to medical services go, where people who don't drive and need to depend upon transportation like buses. This is where New London is where these families land. Yeah. And oftentimes they have many of them have a set of unique needs. A third of our school system is English language learners. That's an astounding number for a city the size of New London.
I'm not really surprised. When I was a home visitor, most of my students were 3-year-olds who lived in New London, and my class size was 11 to 12, was a caseload, and I typically had 4 or 5 different home languages among my 12 kids, because every year English, Spanish, Creole, but also we had at that time a lot of students from Pakistan, from the Philippines, from Africa. It was just amazing. They came from all over the world.
There are 13 languages being spoken at New London High School. That's how. To me, that's a stunning statistic. But yeah.
Yeah, well, there were 6 languages in my class of 12 kids. And, some of them, it seems like it's just sort of a coincidence. There aren't that many Tagalog speakers or, Chuki speakers, but these were all families that lived in New London, and their kids were going to be in the public schools in a year or 2. So New London has, and maybe talk a little bit about the homeless population and the other things that schools have started to do and had to do that maybe wasn't the case in the 50s and 60s when, those of us who are old now were going to school ourselves.
So we have, I mentioned earlier, roughly a third of our students are English language learners. Something like 23% of our student body has special needs. Sometimes those special needs are something as simple and inexpensive as a student needs to work with a speech and language pathologist for 6 months or a year. And sometimes those needs are involved to the point that a student needs a residential year-round placement. And those types of expenses can cost us $100,000 per student or more. So there's, a significant chunk of our budget is spent on students with special needs. We also have a very robust team that provides support for students struggling with mental health issues. It is no surprise to anyone that the number of young people who experience mental health, it's a crisis among young people. Those numbers have soared. And we see it in the schools. We have children who are dealing with trauma, with family members that have died or been incarcerated or have run afoul of the law or are in hiding because they're undocumented, and these kids are in crisis and they're in trauma. And we have teams of mental health professionals that are trained to work with children in trauma. We follow something known as trauma-informed practices, where the whole goal is to try and ease children's anxieties to the point that they can be in a classroom and read a book and do a math lesson and that sort of stuff. We have a team of social workers that deal with not just the children, but families who are struggling with social emotional issues. We feed children. We are a universal free lunch program because so many of our students meet the threshold that I forget what the limit is. It's like what the threshold is. It's somewhere around 80% that the U.S. Department of Agriculture says, well, if that many kids qualify for free hot lunch, then everybody gets it. So everybody in our school system can avail themselves of breakfast, lunch, and in many cases we're sending food home, particularly on Fridays when we know children are going home to families that are very food insecure. We also provide food for families when we need to. We have approximately 300 students, the number varies from week to week, but about 300 students who are homeless. We know that a child who doesn't have a place to brush his or her teeth in the morning is not likely to come to school. So we have teams of social workers that go out in teams to work with families to try and find temporary housing. In very extreme cases, we have a limited budget, a grant from the federal government where we can put a family up in a hotel for up to 2 weeks. And we're not putting them up at the Mystic Marriott, by the way. These are 30 years ago, school systems didn't have to do any of these things because the community was doing it. And I am old enough to remember that there was a time when the City of New London had a very robust social services department. I think it's probably been at least 15 years since
that maybe even 20.
Yeah, since that was shuttered as a budget cost-cutting move. And, and much of the burden falls to us because we have these children with us for 6 or 7 hours a day.
So on my single term on the Board of Ed, the two things that really struck me about the budget were not much is discretionary. You have, once you've taken into account the contractual obligations, health care for employees and mandates, it's like it isn't like you're in a candy shop picking and choosing other ways, other perks that you can spend money on, because there just aren't.
Government is all about providing services, right? So whether we're talking about education, providing services to children and their families, or the community we live in, providing trash collection and safe streets and fire protection, government is all about providing services.
Yeah.
It's all about the cost of labor, the cost of benefits. Probably 80% of the board's budget is fixed in terms of salaries, benefits, that sort of thing.
Well, I spent a couple months of my life many, many years ago, like 50 years ago, kind of living the libertarian dream, so-called, living, in a forest in Oregon where, there was no electricity or snow plows or telephone service or any of that stuff. And I'll tell you, I really like living in a city where those services are taken care of collectively.
Sure.
So for families to do everything, it would cost a lot more than our property taxes are. So sometimes I think it's a little misguided when people are unhappy about their taxes, because just taking care of the people who live here is not cheap.
From time to time, I will hear from constituents who are unhappy with the size of the board's budget, and a common comment that I hear is, well, I don't even have kids in the school system, but I'm paying for it. That's very true. I don't use the senior center, but my tax dollars support it. And I've never had a fire in my house, but my tax dollars support a fire department in case I do, or in the event somebody else does. And that's the nature of living of living in a community.
Right, and to me, having spent some time not living in a community, it's really more valuable than people think. It's very taken for granted.
I would agree with you. And in a tax-poor city like New London, that takes on a much greater meaning and a much greater importance, because so many of our residents can't afford to do those things for themselves. So we look to government to provide those services.
And I'm a fan of the economist Art Rolnick. He is not really well known, but he was the vice president of research for the Minneapolis Federal Reserve for many, many years. I think he's retired now. But he came to New London. I didn't see him, but he was here about 25 years ago. And his area of expertise was economic development. Mm-hmm. So he looked at what cities do for economic development, which is very much like what New London does. They try to bring big employers in and give tax incentives for all kinds of economic activity in their town. And he looked at it and said, that doesn't actually create economic development, it just moves it around. You might take this company from another town, but that isn't really creating a gain.
Right. Yep.
So, and he's very skeptical of using tax abatements for that. His particular irritation, I guess, is publicly subsidized sports stadiums. But so when asked, so if that doesn't really create economic development, what should you do? And what did he say? Invest in our human capital, education, especially for younger children and especially those in disadvantaged communities, and you get a real return on your investment. So I sometimes think we look at education costs in a very short-term way, because doing it well, really, you get rewards back.
You know, I've always believed that public education is the great equalizer. Right? It is what gives every single child an opportunity and the tools to succeed in life. And whether their definition of success is because they go to medical school and become a world-renowned heart surgeon, or they become a plumber, or they're raising a family and they have children whose lives they're invested in. I mean, we all measure success differently, but the purpose of public education is to provide those tools and to lay the groundwork. And not just for kids. I mean, we have a really robust adult education program that not only enables adults to get their high school diplomas, but provides them with job training skills, links them with area manufacturers, for example, and area businesses, where they can, as they develop the skills, they climb up the economic ladder.
And well, and of course you mentioned all the languages, so we have a large immigrant population. So this might seem like a bit of a diversion, but with, you know, ICE activity around, including having, you know, shown up in New London, what are the schools doing to protect our students?
So we do not ask citizenship status when a child is enrolled. We don't have statistics on how many of our kids might be undocumented or their families or anything else. We do not. We do have a policy that says basically if immigration enforcement shows up at the schools, they're, you know, kept in the foyer like anybody else until a principal comes down and that school will reach out to the superintendent, who will reach out to our attorneys and take guidance from them. It is highly unlikely that an ICE agent is going to show up at an elementary school. Typically,
one would hope.
If they have a warrant, we have to honor the warrant. But it's not likely that they're looking for, they've got a warrant for a 9-year-old kid. It's more likely at places like our adult ed facility, or maybe even the high school or the public library or something like that. So we do have procedures in place. You know, as I said, in the case of a warrant, you have to comply. Otherwise, you know, the response is very different.
You know, a lawyer friend of mine had pointed out that ICE, unlike most enforcement agencies, is enforcing civil instances, not criminal.
Which is why we differentiate if they have a warrant.
Yeah, so a judicial warrant is something that is binding, but ICE usually does not have that.
Correct. I am not aware of any incidences where ICE has visited any of our school facilities.
Well, that's good to hear, but I guess, you know, we've come to times that we have to think about this kind of stuff. It's sort of, it's really unfortunate.
We do, and when this administration, just before this administration was sworn in last January, we actually hosted a series of roundtable discussions that included the mayor, the chief of police, various department heads, to talk about, okay, how do we collectively, as a city and as a community, how will we respond to this?
So I guess the last question I had about the budget at this point is, so what's the current status? What is this coming year looking like?
You know, our budget reductions were awful, and you know, this is the year that, you know, we're feeling the full impact of those reductions. For example, we eliminated all of our summer school programs this past summer, with the exception of those mandated by law. So we're used to seeing kind of in education, it's referred to as a summer slide. Right? Kids leave in June at one level, and they backtrack a little bit in the summer,
Sure.
and so they come in September and they need jump start. This year, that slide was a whole lot steeper than we've seen in a lot of years, and our building principals are attributing that to the fact that we had no summer school programs. So, I mean, there's a consequence to everything, and that is a consequence to having eliminated summer school programs. So it's October, and this is typically the month when the Board of Education meets with the superintendent and sets priorities to begin building next year's budget. We're going to be a little bit late doing it this year because we know that we're losing about $1.2 million in state grant money for Commissioner Network. And so we're dealing with that. So we're going to be a little bit behind before we set those parameters. And when we do, like some years, the board has said to the superintendent, okay, keep your budget that comes to us to a 5% increase. Some years we have said, shoot for the moon, tell us in a perfect world, what do you want? And other years, like for example, last year, we said to the superintendent, we want a same services budget. So if we're doing it this year, we want to know the cost to do it next year. Because of all the loss of federal revenues, that led to almost a $10 million gap. We trimmed about $2.5 million before it went downtown, and I think most people know what happened after that. I don't expect this year to be a whole lot better. We will meet probably early in November when we have a better idea of some of these grants. And we'll charge the superintendent with whatever it is we want her to do. And then, the reason why we begin our process so early is because we want our building principals to have time to meet with their PTOs, with their parents, with their staff, with their families, and get feedback on what do they want to see. All of that feedback, the principals gather all of that information. They put it into a request and they funnel it back to our finance department, usually by mid-December, late December, and then our finance director builds his budget from there. And this is a term that fell out of use years ago, but I don't know how else to describe it. But we use what used to be called the zero-based budgeting approach. Right? So you start with no dollars and you say, okay, we need 8 kindergarten classes next year. So we have to budget 8 teachers and 8 benefits, and we need 10 first grade classes and so on. And so you build the budget up instead of coming down. Usually by very early February, the administration is ready to present their budget to us. We schedule a number of budget hearings. The board does whatever it's going to do. And then by law, we have to have the budget to the mayor by March 15th. Last year, when we scheduled these budget hearings, I sent a personal email invitation to the mayor, his director of finance, every city councilor, and every member of the Board of Finance. I sent them a link to our budget. I gave them the dates and times of the hearings, and I invited them to attend either in person or virtually. And I told them that for anybody that was attending, our normal process is the board meeting begins, we listen to public comment. When public comment is over, the board begins its meeting, and there's no other opportunity for the public to comment. But I did tell them for those that wanted to attend, I would leave the floor open, so as the presentation was progressing, if anybody had a question, just raise your hand and ask your question. We had a couple of members of the Board of Finance that were there both nights, asked a lot of questions. The mayor was there for some, the city's finance director was there for some. Couple of, I think Councilor Sadi was there for most of it. We had a couple of city councilors who were on and off via Zoom. But a troubling number of these people who were voting on our budget didn't bother to attend. So that's a problem.
Well, it is election year.
It is an election year.
And there is a debate on Saturday, and people are encouraged. I really encourage people to to attend. It's an opportunity to ask these questions also. And there's going to be a council debate and a Board of Ed debate. And it would be interesting to ask the the candidates for city council, what they know about the Board of Ed budget and where they stand. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I will not, unfortunately, I'll be out of town and I won't be at the debate, but if somebody asks that question, I'd be very interested in knowing what the answers are.
Well, I assume it's going to be videotaped and
Well, I heard something about Facebook Live. So I may be able to watch it on Facebook, but
you won't feel like you're on vacation, though.
Probably not. Where I'm going, there's a 6-hour time difference, so I may be sleeping when you all are debating.
Yeah, you might be. Although it's an afternoon, 3 to 6, so it might not be too bad. Not as bad as an 8 p.m. When you're 6 hours later. Because some of the issue is that funds from the state and funds from the federal government are maybe not what they should be, what should we all be bugging our legislators to do?
So I think my number one complaint, and I like to explain the board's budget as being broken into 3 chunks. Just about 30% comes from city taxpayers. Probably another 35% comes from the state in the form of an education cost-sharing grant. And the balance is federal and state grants. Probably my biggest pet peeve to the state and the feds is if you're going to mandate that we do something, then you need to fully pay for it. And that never happens. The state legislature took great strides a couple of years ago in sort of revamping the education cost-sharing grant that they send to cities and towns, and that's the state's largest investment in public education. Right? That money actually goes to the city of New London, and that helps to offset what the city of New London is sending to the board. So it's for us, it's about $24 million that comes, 25 million.
Yeah, that's not trivial.
That's not chump change. Yep, that is not chump change. But here's an interesting fact that I would bet no one knows. New London, when the legislature attempted to overhaul the ECS grant program several years ago, they recognized that by doing so, a number of school districts around the state would lose ECS money. So they inserted what is known as hold harmless language. Over a period of years, if you were technically overfunded by this new structure, you would not lose, you would get what you got last year, so you would be held harmless from those changes. So a number of the school districts that are in that hold harmless are places like Greenwich, right? Very wealthy communities, but they are held harmless from any reductions in their ECS. This year, New London is in that category too. No. Riddle me this, Batman. How does New London wind up in the same overfunded category as Greenwich? Well, because New London went through revaluation a few years ago and slashed its mill rate as a result. And without getting too nerdy, before revaluation, we were the 8th poorest municipality in the state. Post-revaluation, we are the 12th poorest municipality in the state. So
Which out of 169 is still not a really great position.
Except that is in part what reduced the pilot aid that came to the city and put us in that hold harmless category. So for at least this year, we are considered overfunded by the State Department of Ed. That is likely to change as state law requires that every municipality go through revaluation. And I forget whether it's 5 years or 10 years, but as those towns below us do their revaluations, the deck gets shuffled and we'll be back to being as poor as we used to be. But right now, In a nutshell, the state considers us not as poor as we used to be.
Even though our residents probably are hurting more.
Correct, and part of that problem is that the state uses a net equalized grand list to make these determinations. So, for example, where we have these big housing complexes, apartment complexes, where we have offered developers tax abatements, let's say it's a $10 million development,
Right.
but you're only paying tax on
Right.
60% of it because you have this abatement. It's still on the grand list at $10 million, even though the city is only collecting taxes based on $6 million.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I don't. I really don't want to go too deep in the,
No.
in the weeds and nerd
yeah,
out too much. But the long and short of it is that in the short run, at least, these tax abatements do not help us.
No. And as I mentioned, Art Rolnick doesn't
Yeah.
really think they help us in the long term all that much as well. And I think last year in 2024 was was one of the years for renewal of the City and Town Development Act. City Council has to do it every 5 years. It used to be a referendum. And there wasn't much discussion. And it's not that I want us necessarily to not pass the act, but I do think that when that 5-year comes and we're talking about renewing it, talking about exactly what our goals are for the money, because it seems like developers come and they just assume they'll get abatements from us. At the same time, they're getting opportunity zone money from the federal government and
Yep.
enterprise zone
Yep.
money from the state government. So the developers, I don't really want to increase their risk, but their risk is being decreased on the backs of us.
Well, I'm going to preface these comments by fully admitting I am not an expert on economic development or tax abatements. But it seems to me that if we are going to give a developer of anything a tax abatement and expect that for the next 10 years the residents
Right.
of the city of New London are going to subsidize, we should at least ask for some performance in return. So if it's a 200-unit apartment building that you are building, then maybe we say, okay, you can have this 10-year tax abatement where your taxes will gradually increase over 10 years, but at the end of 10 years you need to be 95% occupied. And if you are not, then you got to pay back or you got to pay something. I mean, there has to be there should be some quid pro quo.
And I think 2 years ago, Shanice did some research on these same developers building apartment buildings in other towns, and other towns are asking for things, not just occupancy rates, but 10% affordable apartments, or sponsoring some recreational program for youth or something. And it does make sense that we would be expecting something in return.
It's, I understand New London is a distressed municipality. Almost 50% of our real estate is tax exempt. That means people like us are paying 100% of the cost of the city. I understand that, and I understand that no one wants to pay more taxes. But I also think there are choices to be made, and we don't always make the best choice.
No, we don't always really think it through.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the old all-magnet system that New London has, because it's pretty unique, and it seems, to me at least, to have a lot of moving parts.
It has a great deal of moving parts. We are the first and only all-magnet district in the state of Connecticut. We draw students from 31 different towns. The way this works is that if you live outside New London, we try to do a lot of recruiting. Right? So our magnet teams do open houses and school choice nights and all that stuff. So I don't know, let's say you are the parent you live in Ledyard and you're interested in our magnet program. We offer 3 different pathways, the most mature of which is our science and tech pathway, and that's been around the longest. We offer an arts magnet pathway, performing arts, music, graphic design, all of that stuff. And then we offer a global education pathway, and that's the newest of our pathways. So you live in Ledyard, you're looking at all of this, you visit open houses, and you make the choice that you want to send your children or child into one of these programs. You submit your name to a lottery. A lottery is drawn in sometime in the spring, I want to say, and you find out that your 9-year-old has gotten a spot in the science and tech lottery. So you send your child to New London. Ledyard provides the transportation, New London provides the education. The state pays New London somewhere around the order of $10,000 to educate this child from Ledyard. If you are a New London parent and you enroll your child and you get in through the lottery, the state pays New London about $3,000 for that New London student. That was a deal that was done probably 15, 18 years ago, primarily in response to the fact that the city of New London was repeatedly, year after year, flat funding public education, and we just couldn't. We could not continue to go down that path. So there is also a reduced racial isolation component. To comply with the terms of the Magnet grant, 25% of our enrollment in each of those pathways has to come from out of district. And then there is a reduced racial isolation component as well. So basically, it's getting non-minority children into New London to reduce that racial isolation factor. And that piece, I think, sort of came about as an afterthought from the Chef O'Neill lawsuits of the 90s.
Well, New London had always, previously, even with neighborhood schools, been doing some busing, to and from Winthrop or whatever.
Back in the
80s.
Late 80s, early 90s, before I was first elected to the board, New London's elementary schools were found out of balance, out of racial balance, meaning there were too many minority children concentrated in places like Winthrop and Edgerton, as opposed to Nathan Hale and Harbor. So the state at that time required New London to balance that out. And that's when we started putting 6-year-olds on buses from Buchanan Road and taking them down to Ocean Avenue.
Yeah, I know I had a Head Start student in one of my earlier years that lived in my neighborhood near the hospital, and they were being bused to Winthrop. It was kind of ironic because they were African, it seemed odd to me also that, we know the housing policy and housing segregation has influenced, educational balance.
Sure. Yep.
But it seemed odd to me that in some of these suburbs, the whole suburb can have hardly anyone who isn't white, and they're not busing their kids anywhere.
Correct. And so that was that was the underpinnings of the Chef versus O'Neill lawsuit that spent, 20 years winding its way through the courts in Connecticut. The parent of Milo Chef, who was a student in Hartford Public Schools, sued the state on the basis that her son and children like him in Hartford Public Schools were not being given the same opportunities as their more affluent neighbors. It took almost 20 years for that to wind its way through the courts, and in the end it became a legislative settlement, or a problem for the legislature, who probably took 10 of those 20 years to figure out how to deal with this. But the magnet school concept is one of the things that came out of that. And when you think about that, it kind of makes perfectly good sense, right? Like, the state has invested millions in building trade schools for students who are interested in pursuing education in the trades. New London doesn't have a trades program anymore. We don't offer shop at the high school or anything else, because why would we? Your child can go to Norwich Tech, for example, and have state-of-the-art equipment as opposed to a shop class at New London
Right.
that maybe has equipment that's 10 or 20 years old. Right? So it kind of makes sense that you concentrate resources in that manner. And you know, it's been successful in New London, and we draw students from 31 towns. One of the most recent problems we are seeing, though, is because budget woes are not unique to New London. Other cities and towns had the same education budget problems in the spring, and many of them are starting to eliminate their transportation to New London. So we've lost a few families because they've lost transportation. Fortunately, the cities and towns that send the greater number of students are still providing transportation. But that may be an issue that the state is going to have to take a look at. It doesn't do you any good to offer programs of choice if you can't get kids to those programs.
And the underlying idea, I think, is really important. You know, in my Head Start years, I was based in New London, but we also had students from Waterford, East Lyme, Old Lyme, occasionally from Groton, though there were some Head Start programs on that side of the river that, you know, they could take advantage of. And, you know, the city kids and the suburban kids, it was great that they got to know each other.
Absolutely.
So that was so worth it. But, you know, in our case in Head Start, if a child lived in Old Lyme, the parents had to transport them to our play groups.
Mm-hmm.
We would do the home visit wherever they lived, but we didn't. We only bused children into the center those 2 play group days if they lived in New London,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe in Waterford, not far from the border. So yeah, that's. I'm glad New London is doing it, but it's another complication of the program.
It is a complication of the program, but you know, the flip side of that is we get a goodly number of students coming from other cities and towns, but there are also a number of New London kids who have chosen Grasso or the VOAG program at Ledyard, or they are attending Norwich Tech. I mean, the kids, there are choices everywhere. Right? And you know, much different. And you know, when I went to school, I grew up in New London, and I went to Edgerton Elementary School, and then I went to the junior high, and then I went to the high school because the only other option was to go to a parochial school, and my parents were not in favor of that at all. But today, families have lots of different choices.
And I went to public school in Philadelphia and went to just neighborhood schools until I hit high school. And I actually went to a very old magnet school, high school in Philadelphia, Philadelphia High School for Girls, which was a public prep school for girls. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I love the idea of magnet schools. We took public buses to get there, though. We have about 4 minutes left, so maybe how can people in the community get involved, learn more about the board, get to know the programs? What's available?
One thing that everybody should be aware of is that Board of Education meetings are standardly held on the 2nd and the 4th Mondays of every month, 7 p.m. We meet at the Family Resource Center at Shaw's Cove, but there is always a Zoom option. So you never have to leave your living room or the comfort of your own
So like City Council, you can watch.
Correct, you can watch. There is an opportunity for even people attending via Zoom to offer comment during the public comment portion of our meeting, which is always at the start of our meeting. And then after, once public speaking is over with, the board moves into its regular meeting and there is no time for a public comment. We offer a series of open houses, mostly celebrating our magnet programs. There is always a schedule of those events on our website, New London Public Schools website. All board members' email addresses are available on the website, and in fact, we encourage people that have questions, email us. you mentioned the debate on Saturday. I'll be out of town and not unable to attend the debate, but I certainly hope that if debate goers or even the young people who are asking questions have questions for me, avail yourselves of my email address. Reach out to me. I try to be very responsive to questions from New Londoners, and most of my fellow board members are exactly the same. So lots of opportunities. There are volunteer opportunities.
Now, are there committees that have public members as well?
There are. The policy committee has 2 community members at large. The school facilities and program design committee has 1. Our curriculum committee, don't remember whether it's 1 or 2. But again, anybody who is interested in that can certainly reach out. This is an election year, so at our first meeting in December, we'll be reassigning committees. And so if there is any interest, reach out to us. We're happy to follow up with a phone call and talk with you and see what your interests are and see if we can get you involved some way, in some manner.
So in the last minute we have, I don't have a slide of the ballot, but I've shown it a few times and we can see it. Yes, and you are on 3 lines, way over on the right side.
The best comes last.
Yeah, but the way our Connecticut ballots are, when candidates are cross-endorsed, their name actually appears multiple times. And so through a complicated set of events, Elaine ended up on 3 lines. I don't know that you were ever officially endorsed by the DTC.
Well, I think I backed into it when there was no primary when somebody dropped out.
But you are on their line.
I am on their line.
I don't know that they ever voted you onto their line, but they might have. I don't know.
No, I think it just happened.
It just happened.
There were 8 candidates for 7 slots, and then there were 7 candidates for 7
and
slots.
And so no point having a primary.
Right, which was kind of disappointing because I had spent some time, as you know, circulating petitions and getting signatures to get on the ballot. And then it was, I'm not going to say it was all for naught. One thing that I learned in that process was that there's a whole lot of people out there who support the work that we're doing. Not unlike the Green Party when you reached out to me and said, let's talk, and working families.
And one thing we have learned over the decades is that people assume that viewpoints run along party lines, and they don't necessarily. There have been not just the education issue, but many issues over the years that it's not really a matter of party where you stand on that issue and what your passion is.
I could not have said that better. You're absolutely correct. So let's vote for the person, not the party. Right.
Yeah. So we'll see you next week. Next week we're going to have our 3 candidates who will be appearing only on the Green Line, Line D. Grandma Dot Ames, Lucian Varela, and Keith Kimball. And we're going to talk more about, I don't know, the election and the Green View. So thank you for coming on the day before you're going on vacation. Enjoy your time off.
Thank you much.
And we will see you all next week.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on.